Okay, so hey everybody. Today we are talking about if we can conserve our way out of environmental issues. So the rest of this class here on out are going to be different questions and solution or attempted solutions, I should say, that people have tried to use in order to solve the environmental problems that we face. So in the early 19th century, the environmental problems that we were facing had more to do with just access to land, making sure that natural resources were using properly. Properly should be in scare quotes, because different people had different ideas of what that should look like. From a generally white, global, Western, Euro-American perspective, use needed to be a form of getting the most bang for your buck, so to speak, getting the most capital good out of anything. Other conceptions, obviously, not. Believe it or not, the whole world is not in capitalism and has not been in capitalism. So there are different conceptions of what nature and natural resources should be that have fallen counter to that. And that is how we get the competing claims that we talked about yesterday. But one way that people have said, we can address climate change, we can address the sixth mass extinction, we can address a loss of biodiversity is by thinking through conservation and by conserving. This can sometimes be used as a synonym for preservation, which we will talk about next week. Preservation is closer to, national parks, closer to not using a space for anything but seeing it, or using it as a natural kind of labscape, a nature lab that's outside. Conservation can have some aspects of preservation, but as you'll see today, there are a lot of different ways that conservation can and have played out. And I think that this is the best place to start, because from my perspective, at least, this is where a lot of people start. Like when they think about environmentalism or environmental sustainability, I know that this was the case for me when I started to have an interest in the topic. It just seems so natural. It's like, well, we just have to have a good balance. We just have to have a balance between the things, all of the different ways that people want to use something. However, and that's what I thought, especially when I was in AP Environmental Studies in high school, and even as when I was pursuing my BA and I wasn't explicitly studying the environment, I was getting up to other mischief. That was definitely something that I subscribed to. However, as you all know, the environment is much more complicated than that. We are in a complex system of systems, and that perspective can make things harder. It can be, I mean, just in the little example we looked at yesterday, there can be so many different competing claims over many different kinds of commons, that the blanket idea of, yeah, we just have to find a balance is great, but sometimes impossible, because sometimes these competing claims override each other. So before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to make sure I stick with the script, so to speak. So I'll stop myself here remind you that tomorrow is the midterm, and instead of a weekly response, you are not turning in a weekly response. You'll complete a 14 question midterm that focuses on the content covered in class thus far. The midterm quiz must be completed and submitted on Gaucho Space by Thursday, which is tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. So you will not have class. You do not have to do it during class time. It will be a little tricky. I will try to throw in some curveballs there. There will also be some writing, so some will be multiple choice. A few will be short answer. When I say short answer, I mean 5 to 8 sentences. So nothing, no mini essays or anything. But in that short amount of time you do, or a short amount of space for writing, you do want to make sure that you're making all of your points clear and you're getting them across in a way that is answering the breadth of the question. So you have the study guide on near the top of the Gaucho Space that you can reference just to make sure you have a working knowledge of what these things are, what they mean, how they work. And if you have that, you are definitely ready for this midterm. Again, it is a quiz. I feel like test carries a lot of weight to it. This is a portion of your grade, and you do want to do well on it, but I am trying to make it not crazy high stakes. As if you've been paying attention, if you've been taking notes, you should be fine. You should be fine. If you've been taking a lot of notes and you've been reviewing and you fill out most of the study guide, you're likely doing very fine. And hopefully it'll just be something that you're able to knock out quickly and then live the rest of your beautiful Thursday tomorrow. So today we have some pets to talk about. I believe these are Carmenita's. She shared a few pets, and I've included the descriptions that she has for them as well. We are going to coo. We are going to, yes, we are going to awe, and we are going to just spend a minute appreciating some of these beautiful creatures. So this is Princess. According to Carmenita, she is really friendly, likes to run in the middle of the night. My cats do that too. And recently learned how to turn off the lights. That is a smart kitty. Also a little terrifying, I'm sure, especially if it's in the middle of, it not in the middle of the night, but as you're maybe getting ready to go to bed and all of a sudden lights turn off. I know for me, I'd be worried that maybe there was a ghost or something. So Princess is a floof of mischief, and I appreciate her. This is Figaro, and she's real lazy and is scared of everything, but whenever she sees you sitting at the desk, she'll immediately climb up and sit in front of you until you pet her. Oh, she doesn't really like people and hisses at strangers. You know what? Sometimes I have that energy as well. So Figaro, I get it. I understand it. You have eyes that are looking into our souls, and we appreciate you. Rockruff, which I was very excited because Rockruff is named after a Pokemon character. Also, just a little like ball of sunshine. Oh my god, I just wanna cuddle. I want to cuddle this dog, and I also want to play Pokemon at the same time. I don't know if I'd be able to do both at the same time, but I would try. And this is Sasha. So Sasha is really energetic and loves to go on runs. I do not understand that energy, but I respect it. Look at that smolder. Look at that tongue. Look at that. Oh, look at that just white fur that is just ready to go jump in some snow. We love it. We stan it. We want more of it. Good for you, Sasha. And I believe this is the last one, and this is Matthew. And according to Carmenita, he likes to bite her, but he will let her grandpa and cousins pet him. So his name is Matthew or Mateo. I really appreciate the aesthetics of the toy that's above him. There's a lot of beautiful colors going on, including on Mateo. I have an appreciation for birds, but I do not have any of my own. But Mateo, you are just, oh, you look so happy. Oh, you look so happy. Okay. I think that is our last pet of the day. So let me check the chat real quick. Okay, yes, we were all appreciating the animals. This is great. So, conservation. What is conservation? Well, conservation is the care and protection of natural resources so that they can persist for future generations. Conservation includes maintaining the diversity of species, genes, and ecosystems, as well as functions of the environment, such as nutrient cycling. And nutrient cycling is if you're a little confused, it is a form of ecosystem management. It is basically making sure that there is a balance within the whole local ecosystem, ensuring that it just really ensuring that there's a balance between the flora and fauna of the area. There's more, and you can take classes on that, but for our purposes, here we are. So conservation is like preservation, which again, we'll talk more about preservation next time. But while both relate to the protection of nature, they strive to accomplish this task in different ways. So conservation, which we'll be talking about today, seeks a sustainable use of nature by humans for activities such as hunting, logging, or mining, while preservation means protecting nature from human use. So conservation is closer to what you hopefully maybe skimmed for today, Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which is understanding that humans are, condensing this very quickly, understanding that humans are part of the ecosystem and what they can do, and that their actions are part of it, part of the bigger system of systems, and that as they can do within reason, basically whatever extractive activity they want on there, as long as it is not harming or damaging others. Of course, Aldo Leopold's idea of conservation is different than other conservationists. In particular, I'm thinking of Gifford Pinchot, who was the first director of the U.S. Forest Service, who was basically used that branch, used the service as a side branch of the military to ensure that natural resources were available for the rest of the nation, and especially for the military and what they need. So conservation can be, really trying to maintain a balance between oneself and the nature that surrounds them, but it also can be a more utilitarian effort, and we'll get into a little bit more of what that means in a few slides. So conserving nature is essential for addressing climate change. Addressing climate change is essential for conserving nature. So we have to have some sort of balance. What that balance looks like, of course, will depend on the context, which includes the local ecosystem and the people who are in it. But this balance is important because otherwise, especially where humans are now as a species, if we don't find some sort of balance, we will either kill ourselves by not having enough resources, or kill ourselves through aforementioned global climate change and the sixth mass extinction. So a lot of people, myself included, as I shared earlier, when I was younger, wondered, can we conserve our way out of all of these environmental problems? In some ways, yeah, we can make steps towards doing that. There are nature-based climate change solutions, which means conserving and restoring ecosystems, because these nature-based solutions are essential. So these Solutions, I mentioned nutrient cycling earlier. They provide up to 37% of the emission reductions that are needed by 2030 in order to keep global average temperature increases under 2 degrees Celsius. So you may have heard that idea kicked around a lot. Basically, if we want to survive, if we want to have a chance of surviving climate change, we need to reduce our emissions enough to get the global average temperature under 2 degrees Celsius. So we can't keep increasing. We need to be decreasing and fast. Also, nature-based solutions are relatively cheap. So using only cost-effective solutions, nature's mitigation potential is estimated at 11.3 billion tons in 2030. So this is the equivalent of stopping burning oil globally. And also nature-based solutions also come with multiple benefits. So these can include water filtration, flood buffering, improved soil health, protection of habitat, and enhanced climate resilience. And all of this is from the Nature Conservancy. They have conservation in their name, but also they're one of the oldest, but not the oldest attempts of getting together communities to fight for conservation. Of course, there was the Sierra Club, the Save the Redwoods, and then more local, like hyper local groups throughout the US and in other places. But the Nature Conservancy, I believe, started in 1955, and they have very much ascribed to this idea, obviously, of conservation. Again, it is in their name, but thinking of the ways that we can really work towards finding a balance with nature. Okay. Alyssa asked, what is flood buffering? And Isaac answered, many wetlands act as a buffer zone for flooding from hurricanes or storms. Yes, I love when you all work together. This is great. There have been a lot of achievements from conservation. One of which being that it involves a lot of people working together. It is a vast and diverse endeavor. It has led to hundreds of state, national, and international laws. There have been dozens, note dozens, not hundreds, not thousands, just dozens, but that's still pretty cool. Dozens of species saved from extinction. It's forced international cooperation for conservation problems, and that's no easy feat, as we'll see throughout the rest of this quarter. There, especially because there are a lot of stakes that come with some of the competing claims that we'll see, especially on an international or transnational level where you have multiple nations fighting over a shared resource. The stakes are huge. So getting people to cooperate when the stakes are that big is amazing. Almost 15% of the world's terrestrial and inland waters are now protected. So protected here is just some form of designation for conservation management. Not all of these are perfect, and in fact, most of them aren't, but there are steps towards protection for at least 15% of these terrestrial and inland waters. Similarly, 10% of the coastal and marine areas are protected, and approximately 4% of the global ocean is protected. 4%, not to make a bad pun, but really seems like a drop in the ocean. However, these places this 4%, while small, has been used really judiciously in areas to ensure that there are parts of the ocean that oceans that were most threatened, and it was basically to try to save areas around the Arctic. It was like a lot of this 4% is basically just to stop drilling for oil. So today, even though I assigned initially and then made it optional because it wasn't visible to you until yesterday, I assigned a piece on African conservation. However, because that wasn't available, we're going to focus a little bit more on US wildlands and protected areas and then loop back around to it. The readings that I assigned, and again, didn't post in time or didn't have visible in time, are very good chapters from an excellent book. So if you do have time and if you have any interest, especially in why conservation is so white, I would highly recommend that you read it. But for today's lecture, and of course also for the midterm, that is off the table. So today, US wildlands and protected areas. So you can see on this map, they're looking at the scale of wildland conservation value. You can see that a lot of places more east, have a lower limit, while at places in the west, particularly the coastal west, have a much higher value. Oh, Natalie, you're not muted. This is for a couple reasons. One, that you can see that these areas were some of when the area that was now the US was settled, we had, especially by European empires, we had a lot of settling, obviously, in this area, and then with westward expansion in the early 19th century, folks moved west and settled. There's also there's significantly less, just naturally, in this area, diverse topography. There are less changes in the land, so to speak, here, because conservation has to do not only with the species that you're trying to protect, but also the landscapes that you're trying to protect and the ecosystems that you're trying to protect, and what those things provide. And sometimes it's the actual natural resource, and sometimes it's the actual tourism that brings folks in. So that's, again, another reason why there is so much in the West. It was, besides Spanish, some French, and some Russian invasion and settlement in this part of what's now the US West, or sorry, what's now the US. There wasn't too much destruction and clear cutting, especially in the ways that there were in this side of the US. You can see, though, that Central Valley, which has similar rangelands that we see in the Midwest, are not considered to have much of a conservation value. That isn't to say that we don't appreciate the Central Valley or the Midwest, just that they are different places that have different local ecosystems. So let's talk about values a little bit. The value basis for nature conservation, because at the end of the day, nature conservation is about values. So it assumes that free markets cannot provide all the things that people want from nature. It also means that nature must be intentionally and usually scientifically managed to maximize its values. Also, conservation puts restraints, that should be restraints, not restrains, restraints on individual people's use of nature so that more people may benefit for a longer period. Values aren't just about what people feel, but also what things are worth. And I think that that's something to make sure that it's on the top of your head for the rest of for the rest of this quarter, because of course we're going to be talking about the different kinds of values that we see in the ways that we can serve nature, preserve nature, conserve nature. But it also comes to, especially when thinking about actions, what the values of the person are, and if a person's or a nation's values are very driven by money, that will impact what conservation or any other management will look like. And all of this is to say, most people agree that these three things are good things in principle, but like I said, in practice, there are many challenges and conflicts. So again, what are values? So values come into play when we confront trade-offs with unclear solutions. Sometimes this can be competing claims. Other times this can have different appearances with ensuring the success of a species, a certain species over another. There are lots of different trade-offs to always consider. Values also come into play when our preferences or convictions are in conflict. So, you know, maybe I love puffins. I love puffins so much. However, and that's my preference. However, I have a conviction of puffins staying in their own ecosystem, which is not Southern California. That is a piss poor but still usable example of preferences and convictions in conflict. Values also come into play when we confront choices that involve multiple variables, and also when we're trying to translate values into decisions and behaviors, and they're limited by intervening factors and constraint. Because again, ecosystems are a complex system of systems. We have different, we have a lot of different things to consider. Nothing is ever clear cut. Well, bad joke. Maybe some forests in the 17th to 21st, unfortunately, century, but making decisions is not. Values are not necessarily rational in any economic sense or logical sense. Sometimes values are also not deterministic for any given decision or factor, and values are also not necessarily encompassing all factors in decision making. Sometimes there can be cherry picking when making a decision, and sometimes that cherry picking can be based again on preferences and convictions, and also related to that, preferences on a legislative, so on a law level, can be racist, classist, sexist, and generally xenophobic. Things to consider. So of course I have me with a tree. So what are values? They are related to, and this can be on a personal, communal, or national, or even international level. They're related to attitudes, traits, norms, needs, preferences, beliefs, worldviews, roles, behavior. Yeah, they don't always make sense, but they're what we love and what we care about and what we feel like we need. We talked yesterday about the Aristotle's tripartite soul. Not all of this is related to logos. There's a lot of gut and there's a lot of heart that is considered when we think about values. Sometimes logic is considered, but it's a logic that's also informed by the two other parts. Okay, we have some things in the chat. And Billy is answering questions because he's an excellent person in TA. So let's get into some specific kinds of values. So there can be anthropocentric values, and this can be out of self-interest, which is a desire to improve the condition of or reduce risk to oneself and one's nearest relatives. Remember, anthropocentric means human related. So out of self-interest, you have a self-interest to ensure the survival of maybe you and the people that you love and care about. Anthropocentric values can also relate to the community, group, or species interest. So perhaps you have a desire to improve or secure the condition of the area or the community of people bigger than you, whether that is your local community, like your neighborhood or your city, or also just humans in general. You want to make sure that humans survive. That is an anthropocentric value. And also just a sense of altruism. So that means an inherent and unconditional desire to do good, unrelated to self-interest. So this can be problematic in evolutionary theory when we're thinking about Darwin, when we're thinking about, he didn't say this, but the idea of the survival of the fittest. But altruism comes more from culture. And again, values do not operate by rational logic all the time. Altruism, I would argue, has some, some logos to it. It makes sense in some ways to be altruistic, but altruism can even push further and deeper than that to make people do things that they don't want to do for either a sense of greater good or a bigger picture that pushes further than their most immediate satisfying their most current desires and think much further into the future or much bigger than oneself. Another aspect that could, in my opinion, is an almost can be related to a logical version of altruism, in my opinion, is utilitarianism. And that holds that resources should be managed for the greatest benefit for the most people for the longest time. So this is trying to, in my opinion, trying to be a logical version of altruism. So trying to benefit the most people. However, altruism is just doing it for the sake of doing good, whereas utilitarianism is trying to make the most people happy, which has its own logic. So this is related to what philosophers have called the greatest happiness principle, and it's associated with instrumental value, which holds that the value of something comes from its usefulness. This idea comes from primarily Jeremy Bentham, and also John Stuart Mill, his student, but Jeremy Bentham explains it as such in 1798. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong. On the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. So nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So while this is an admission that utilitarianism isn't always comfortable, and frankly, neither is altruism, but it is serving, again, in Bentham and John Stuart Mill's perspective, a greater good, which is the bigger or the most benefit that could be reaped for any predicament. Other anthropocentric values. I got a lot of them, and these are only the heavy hitters. But two more anthropocentric values is social ecology and ecofeminism. So we've talked a little bit about ecofeminism, or we did last week, and I will plug ES 184, Gender in the Environment, if you are interested in diving deeper into this. But for class today, ecofeminism is the diverse realm of scholarship and activism that looks at environmental problems through the lens of gender, while social ecology is the environmental damage is both caused by and a symptom of larger patterns of injustice in human societies. And you can learn more about that in ES 185, Human Environmental Rights. So these both are thinking about society, ecofeminism, really diving into one defining aspect of society, where social ecology is considering justice in a broader way, and how justice and injustice has shaped humans' understanding of nature and its use. I got some non-anthropocentric values for you too. So one is biocentrism. So again, value, we're still talking about values. Values exist in individual organisms or biological entities. So this can be related to different forms of vegetarianism and veganism, and just the animal rights movement more broadly. A staple for that movement is Animal Liberation by Peter Singer, which came out in 1975. And in it, Singer rejects a discourse of rights that need to be given to animals, and instead focus on the interests of non-human beings. So it's getting away from just thinking that, you know, even though an animal's an animal and not a human, we should give them rights anyway. He is arguing, like, screw rights. We just need to think about the interests for all, and we need to see these the interests of animals in his case, but others have made cases for plants as well, that we need to focus on their interests for, some would say, for the good of the whole ecosystem, the whole system of systems, while others would say that plants and animals have an intrinsic value and have intrinsic interest just by existing. An example that doesn't quite go as far for plants as Peter Singer does with animals is a book I really like, called, of course, because it's plants, but it's called Should Trees Have Standing by Christopher Stone. And this actually came out 3 years before Animal Liberation. And he asks the questions whether non-human beings should have legal standing to protect their interests in court. This is a bit related to what the Yurok tribe is now doing with the Klamath that we talked about yesterday, in which they the Yurok tribe's legal team has offered the rights of personhood to the Klamath River. There have been multiple moves to try to make either individuals of any species or entire species, or what some would call geographical points of interest, like rivers, giving all of these aspects of nature a form of personhood or a form of respect that will stand up in court ultimately. Because where does all of this mediation happen, especially now, but and going back the last at least 200 years, it goes back to the courts, and thinking about how different groups will, you know, make their case, make their argument for whether or not they should have the right to use or not use different parts of the environment. Related a bit to biocentrism is an idea of ecocentrism. So while bio is just focusing on anything that's living, and just focusing on that, ecocentrism is a value that exists in the collections of organisms and natural entities. So bio is focused on each individual, where ecocentrism is focusing on the collection and how these things work together. An example of this, again, is Aldo Leopold in A Sand County Almanac, which, if you haven't read it, I really hope you do. It is one of those foundational texts that if you are an ES major, or you have any interest in the environment and you hang out with environmental circles, this will come up So you want to make sure you're at least a bit familiar, at least with his idea of a land ethic. And basically it can be condensed into: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So we can see Aldo Leopold here to the right. His children and I believe grandchildren now have continued upholding his legacy of doing conservation work. There's also an Aldo Leopold Foundation that does a lot of education and public facing work to make arguments for this ecocentric way of seeing the world and being in it. However, even going even more deeply than ecocentrism is deep ecology, which is a wing of ecocentric environmental philosophy that goes deeper. It argues that the inherent value of non-human beings and nature more broadly, and it promotes a radical restructuring of society for a truly sustainable future. So it is not just seeing the value of the connection of all flora, all fauna, and fauna, including humans, but it is calling for action to ensure that that connection is not only respected, but also sustained for the future. So at the center of this movement is the notion that non-human nature has a right to flourish independent of utilitarian, which we talked about before, or instrumental human needs. So this challenges a lot of long-held ideas about human exceptionalism, that humans are the top of the food chain, that humans are the not only apex predator or apex species, but just the most important thing in the world, the most important thing in this universe or galaxy. So while deep ecology challenges these beliefs, it has also often failed to address how such an ethic can be made relevant to diverse people and cultures. Because of course it can be easy for folks who have a lot of material and cultural and social resources. So think of think of the Kardashians, but they're not really environmentally minded. Think of like a very, very, very rich environmentalist. We don't really have too many of those anymore. And 60 years ago, I would say Rockefeller, and you'd say, yes. But think of like a very rich person with a lot of material, social, and cultural resources. And it can be very easy for someone with all of that to say, yes, everything is equal and I have no right to anything. And I can just live my life in total communion with nature. And that's great. And that can be much easier for someone who has the time and money to do that. But I mean, I don't know about you, but speaking for myself, I can't afford to do that. I would love to just live off the land and be in a commune, and maybe that's still in my cards. No, I'm kidding. Probably isn't. But even then, even for your living off the land commune, you need capital and you need money to make that happen, because at the end of the day, you are still, like, our broader system of systems has a lot of capitalism in it and has a lot of racism, sexism, colonialism, classism that makes it impossible for everybody, or maybe if not impossible, very hard for a lot of folks to live this way. So deep ecology is another thing like ecofeminism or social ecology that if you stick around enough, or if you've already taken some ES classes, you have likely encountered. But I do have the responsibility, if I'm talking about it, saying that while it is a great, I think rationally a great and cool idea to aspire to, it is for the most part an impossibility for lots of folks. I can think of very few people who would be able to do such things, because again, we are all interconnected, we are all in a system of systems, and it is hard to do such a and live by such a steadfast kind of philosophy of nature. I've been talking, I mean, at least in talking about deep ecology, I've been talking a lot about materialism. So materialism is the belief that money matters. However, there are some post-materialist theses that are out there about how people can and should connect with nature aside from money. And these are things that need to be considered when we're thinking about conservation. So poor people tend to care more about meeting their basic needs and less about other issues. Again, my example of the Rockefellers, who, if you don't know, was a very, 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 very rich man with very, very, very rich children and surrounding family. Unless you are somebody like that, you are, for the most part, thinking about your basic needs and maybe less about other issues. Other things to consider is that as wealth grows, people begin worrying not only about their necessities, but also the quality of life issues. And so in this formulation, the environment counts as a quality of life issue, not a basic need. And so richer people tend to have more environmentally oriented values that make more environmentally conscious decisions and support more pro-environment policies. Of course, this is not always the case. I think I'm not speaking too out of turn to say that recent politicians have really shown that, having lots of money but not really caring about the environment so much. And that's why I have tend here. They tend to make environmentally oriented values because they have the opportunity to. I have talked about the Kuznets curve in the past. I took it out because I don't know how often it comes up in other classes, but there is this idea that you can predict that environmental damage will lessen in an area if there is more increased wealth. Okay, good, Natalie. I'm glad that you heard about that in a couple different classes. Yes, so post-materialism kind of can take us to weird places. I think a lot of times when people who maybe haven't taken ES classes think about conservation, again, they just think about the balance. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's a lot of other things that are part of the balance and part of the equation that aren't always considered when we just say, yeah, conserve the environment, reduce, reuse, recycle, which still great thing, but there's lots of other things to consider, including Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When you don't have a lot of access to resources, you're really just focusing on this bottom one and hopefully this one. As unfortunately you get more of this, you get more wealth, you're able to eventually work on building up to self-actualization. However, this isn't possible for everybody on this planet, or frankly, historically, most people who have ever existed have really only focused on this. Love and belonging is globally a much more recent, I don't want to say discovery, but more recent concern that people are trying to get. Esteem, so it isn't just power, it is a feeling good about oneself, and all of that can lead to self-actualization. But these things, for the most part, are much more recent developments, partially that have come from money, and a lot of that money has come from being able to utilitarianly conserve and conserve natural resources to get the most money out of it. Because as this says, the more, unfortunately, more wealth one has, or a community has, or a nation has, generally speaking, there's going to be less environmental damage. So where do you think the following environmental features or services should go in Maslow's scheme? So like I like to play this game with a smaller group, but feel free to maybe just pick one and say where it would go. I don't know why the E of energy is with food, but here we are. There is no right or wrong answer, but if you're feeling compelled, maybe just say wilderness is actually related to safety, or city parks are related to physiological. I like maybe just pick one. I'm kind of curious what you're all thinking. Clean water should go in physiological, safety, ocean health, biodiversity, food, psychological, clean air, safety, food, psychological, food and energy. Yeah. Are any of these in self-actualization? Toxins, physiological. I'd say probably city parks. Yeah, Anna, I agree. Maybe, yeah, maybe food. Because self-actualization is just feeling like you are your best version of yourself. Maybe wilderness. Yeah, again, there isn't a right or wrong answer, but I think when we break apart different aspects of natural resources and compare it to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can kind of see, we can think about not what is more important than others, but what should maybe be more, what should be thought about as a more universal issue than other things. So, for example, people with less access to resources may or may not have so much care about the wilderness, but they sure as hell are thinking about the toxics in their water, toxins in their water, or if they live in a coastal town, maybe they fish, they're thinking about ocean health. So this is just I don't know, I like doing this activity because it lets me kind of see where some of your heads are at. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of conservation. So in 18th century Europe, again, this is going to be kind of a global Western view of conservation. Other groups, especially different indigenous groups all over the world, have had different conceptions of relation to nature that we can and should consider conservation. However, it would be a bit ahistorical to apply this term to it, and so I'm not going to. But I do want to acknowledge that many indigenous groups all over the world, not just in the US or the North and South America, lots of indigenous groups have, out of necessity, had different forms of conservation to ensure their survival and to ensure the health and wealth of the community that they were part of and the communities that would follow after. However, conservation as a philosophical idea, and by being a philosophical idea, also being a policy idea, and ideas that have had real legal standing That's the best thing I can say. Real legal standing in different competing claims, especially in court. We have to dig into these specific origins. So in 18th century Europe, conservation developed to use science to produce more natural resources on a continent where many such resources had already been depleted. So this is in part tied to colonialism. You have a lot of European empires developing science to understand their colonies and also find ways to get the most out of the natural resources in those colonies. So this tradition especially took off in Germany and other countries, especially around the Swiss Alps, that developed forestry techniques. And then in the 19th century, particularly around the Industrial Revolution, so this is roughly around 1850, US industrialists became interested in finding ways to use natural resources more effectively with less waste. So the Industrial Revolution, you have the creation of factories, and the creation of factories slowly but surely works towards finding as much as many places to make things as efficient as possible. And with that search for efficiency, you have something that really mirrors the utilitarian view of using nature to get the most out of it. However, the greater good in this sense is money, 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 money. So in the 19th century United States, conservation emerged as a progressive era response to waste and also the exploitation of the the Gilded Age. So you have a whole bunch of basically rich white men making bunches and bunches of money through the extraction of natural materials, just making nature basically into a factory through different extractive industries, especially logging, but also mining, industrial farming. It begins in the early 20th century. So this is late 19th century, the progressive era, 1880, 1890s to the Gilded Age, which follows right after. So we can see the Vanderbilts, we can see Millions, the Goulds, who also have lots of money, and we see these caricatures of rich white men who are benefiting off of the labor and of poor folks and the waste of the land. But then we have so through the progressive era, through thinking about how we can try to fight against exploitation of both the worker and nature, we have conservation and preservation really start to form. And this is very much a US story. That did spread through the rest of the world. So again, not to say that different forms of conservation and preservation did not happen in other places before the late 19th and early 20th century. However, from the philosophical perspective that informs policy, here is where we are. And this is different than there aren't any other Gifford Pinchot's or John Muir equivalents in any other place. So while this is a US story, this is truly like a US story, conservation and preservation, and the ways that they're used throughout most of the world today actually came from these debates. And so the debate was really between utilitarian conservation and nature preservation. Utilitarian conservation with Gifford Pinchot, who, like I said, controlled the U.S. Forest Service, first person to do so, and John Muir, a thin grandpa-looking sir who wanted to just preserve nature as it is. I also have to say that while I am really grateful for some of the work that both of these men did to inform my fields of study, they also said really awful, really sexist and racist things in their life. John Muir, unfortunately, especially has a longer record of, especially in his younger days, saying awful racist things against Black folks and Indigenous folks. I need to acknowledge this, though. Later in his life, he didn't apologize, but you could see that there was some change. He still said some really trash things, and this has to be acknowledged, even though he did a lot of great work. He also said some really awful trash things that had some really awful consequences for non-white people, so Black, Indigenous people of color. So yeah, nature grandpa Santa was kind of trash. So utilitarian conservation versus nature preservation. Both of these are really happening late 1890s to the beginning of the 20th century. So we have Gifford Pinchot, first chief of the US Forest Service, and then we have John Muir, trash nature Santa, who was an adventurer, activist, and author. The debate between utilitarian conservation and preservation was about the highest use of lands and natural resources, especially places that were scenic, like places that became national parks. So John Muir famously fought for Yellowstone, and that the creation, or Yellowstone and Yosemite, and the creation of Yellowstone as a national park in 1872, Yosemite being created as a state park in 1863, and then later as a national park in 1890. That is what he was really fighting for. He was fighting for vistas, where Gifford Pinchot was fighting for use and efficient use. The questions that they were kind of going between is, should we exploit the resources in such areas sustainably, or just try to protect them completely from any further development? So while Pinchot said that we should use all of nature's resources in a sustainable and scientifically justifiable manner, Muir believed that some places should be protected for their intrinsic value, not just their resource value. However, I mean, Yosemite being John Muir's baby, sequoias actually can't be logged. It is actually very hard to extract from that part of the Sierras. So though people tried, and if you are ever interested in hearing about that, I can sing you a song about that. But yes, so they're not in complete disagreement, but there are again, values differences that are happening between utilitarian conservation and nature preservation. Traditional goals, just generally speaking, of conservation in the United States. So late 19th and early 20th centuries, we want sustainable lands. We want wildlife extinction to go down. We want some parks. They don't have to be crazy. We'll leave the crazy parks for preservationists like Muir. And we want some restoration of damaged lands. And we want the restoration so that those lands can be used to be more efficient in the future. However, by the mid to late 20th century, conservation became much more focused on clean air and water, habitat, so much more biodiversity, and endangered species more broadly. So we can see in the late 19th to early 20th centuries, they're still focusing on more specifics of use. And then by the mid to late 20th century, it's like, we just need to slow things down. We need to stop using and figure out how to do things sustainable so that we can have some semblance of balance back. So humans have always been concerned with conservation, like I said. Conservation as a practice has been intrinsic to human survival. Different indigenous groups all over the world have had different ways that they practice this. Sometimes what could be considered conservation practices are part of their religion or cultural culture. I don't know what I was going to say after cultural. Other times it was just out of necessity that that different groups figured out how to strike a balance between their survival and the survival of the land that they were on. And like I said, indigenous groups globally have practiced conservation throughout their histories. I just have to say this one more time to really just highlight it for you. I think it's really important because a lot of material that we cover in this class, unfortunately, just because there's so much to cover, ends up being focused more on the global West, because this is an introduction for the many different paths that you can take in ES. And unfortunately, while we do have classes that are focused on the global South and some on indigenous land management practices, for the most part, a lot of the values, a lot of the legal issues potentially that you're dealing with are coming from, unfortunately, again, a very white global North, global West, however you want to encapture that perspective. And that is something that I know that the department is working on and has, I think, at least in my 4 years being here, done a great job in moving towards and doing and doing well, or working towards doing well. But I just always need to highlight, indigenous groups have globally always practiced conservation throughout their whole histories. So with this in mind, we need to talk about white conservation, which I think the chapters that I assigned for today and have now made optional really kind of get to. But I'll just kind of sum it up for you. So there's white conservation. So how did we get here? And the authors of the book do a really good job at laying a lot of different parts out, but the two that come up the most throughout the book is hero worship. So these are issues of power that are related to racism. So sometimes racism can just be seeing white or global Western or Northern people or places as supreme. Sometimes it can also be turned inward for folks who are not white or not male or not rich. And just generally speaking, this can come up with settler colonialism as well. Hero worship, so when thinking about white conservation, hero worship can also come from, more recently, the media editing and focusing on specific types of stories, so specific types of places being saved by specific types of people. And as our authors for today describe it, it's glorifying white conservationists. So this white conservation kind of introduces us to what they call an arena of intellectual contests. So there are largely ignored parts of the world, like Kenya, for instance, that Western academics fail to study. And also, like I said earlier, there can be a large vacuum of indigenous knowledge of ecosystems in any sort of environmental study, not just in this department, but just more generally. So what I want you to do is, even if you haven't read the chapter, Mabara and Ogata say that conservation is now almost exclusively associated with whiteness. So we've talked about this today, and we've talked about this in other ways in the past 2 weeks, but I'm curious, just if you're here, where do you think this argument comes from, and do you agree with it? Do you agree that conservation tends to be a really white thing? If you wish, explain maybe how you think that we can push against that, whether it's that conservation is a white thing to do, or it just appears that conservation is a white thing to do. So just make sure that you're answering the question that's on the screen. But if you want to make it a little bit more complicated, I would love to hear more of your thoughts on it. And take just like a minute or two. Thank you, Araceli, for laughing at my trash nature grandpa comment. Appreciate it. Very quick. How are we doing? Oh, we are overtime. Oh no. I have so much more to say. Oh no. I knew we were going over. Okay. After I'll save the rest for later. After you finish this question, answering this question, if you feel free to go and have a good day and have a good midterm and take care of yourselves and drink water and good snacks. If you do have other questions that you want to talk to me about, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, take care of yourselves. Have a beautiful day. Get up to some good trouble. Get up to some mischief that makes you feel good, and take care.